Thank you so much. I should just start there. Thank you so much for the lovely introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thank you so much for asking me to come. I've had a wonderful visit that started early yesterday morning. And I've had the opportunity to talk to so many people and engage in such wonderful conversations. So I think I'll bring that up in just a minute. But let me just say that the passage Dr. King-Lactus chose had me in tears about 3 hours ago. Was it even that long ago? A couple of hours ago. So I'm really proud of myself for keeping it together as we. That's okay. So back to my thanks. I want to thank you so much for showing up tonight, this afternoon. There's so many other places where you could be, but I'm excited that we're going to spend a little bit of time together talking about something that I suspect that you care about. Otherwise, I also suspect that you would spend your time someplace else. I have had the opportunity to talk to a lot of people, mostly students, I think. And I will say that over and over again, I quietly got the question, are you really a student? And I assure you that I'm not, in fact, a student, not legitimately so, but I'm really going to take that comment, are you a student? Because pretty soon my body is going to catch up with my age and I won't be able to pass as a student. It's also true that any good teacher, any teacher worth her salt is always a student. So though I'm not legitimately a student, I am a teacher and I take very seriously the idea of positioning myself as a learner, so I'm okay with being a student. It's also true that I am a grown woman with kids and bills and a husband and all that. So the more people think that I'm younger than I really am, I'm just going to take that and run with it. And finally, I'm going to go with being a student, because as long as people think I'm kind of this young, unassuming person, then you won't really get aggravated by what I have to say, at least not right away. So I think I want to begin there. I want to begin with this notion that I want to talk about something that makes people uncomfortable. I want to talk about the issue of schools and prisons and the relationships between those. I want to talk about this book that I wrote and how this book really centralizes that concept. Before I do that, though, I think I want to kind of set the tone for the conversation. Let me first say that though this is a lecture, I generally avoid lectures. My attention span is not very long. So what I prefer to do is open conversations. So I hope you're okay with that, I'm gonna say some things, get us started, and then I'm gonna sort of facilitate some conversation among us, yes? And I'm gonna do it in a very particular way. What I find really helpful when I'm thinking about issues, particularly critical issues, and I'll say more about that in a minute, is that I try to give myself a particular prompt for how to go about thinking about such issues. And that prompt is guided by 3 questions. I'm a teacher, and teachers just happen to do things in threes. I don't quite know why, but we do things in threes. And so I have 3 questions that I want to forefront. And one is, what do I wonder? A second is, what do I worry about? And a third is, what do I question? So I say that because as you listen to me talk and as you prep for the conversation that we'll have together, I want you to do the same thing. I want you to ask yourself, as I come to this room with my own wisdom, with my own concerns, with my own questions, let me try to frame that in a very particular way. So what do I come to this room wondering? What do I come to this room worried about? And what do I come to this room questioning? So I want you to hold on to that. I want to talk specifically to the students in the room. I know there's some faculty members, some of whom I've met, but it feels like by and large this room is filled with students. So I'm going to talk specifically to the students. I want you to think about your purpose here at this esteemed institution, The Ohio State University. I want you to think about why you're here and what you plan to do with this very expensive education that you're getting at The Ohio State University. I want you to consider the fact, and I want to urge you and suggest that one thing you might do is take seriously the task of engaging in critical thinking. And when I say critical thinking, I'm not talking about the ability to engage in reasoned arguments involving critique. You wouldn't have made it this far if you couldn't do that. What I'm saying is I think you ought to imagine your work, your charge, your responsibility here at this esteemed institution as engaging in questions of power and privilege and oppression and the ways in which those three things work on and through people's lives. So that really, I think, is the task, is the way in which I'm going to situate this work, using that framework of wondering, of worrying and questioning, and using the task, the charge, if you will, to focus on critical thinking. I want to say a bit more about this book and about the school to prison pipeline. Yes? I should have set this up while we were chatting. But while I'm clicking, let me thank specifically the individual people who took care of me. Let me make sure I thank Ryan. I want to thank Halima. I want to thank Tanya. I want to thank Carlotta. And I want to thank Dr. Kinlock for making sure that I was good to go. So we don't want to check for updates. We want to click that. And we want to start from the beginning. So, my wonderings. I wonder if you know that you are engaged in either incarceration prevention or incarceration expansion. I want to know, I wonder if you know that you're engaged in either incarceration prevention or incarceration expansion. It really is just that real. So what do I mean by incarceration expansion? Of course, we're going to talk about prevention, but we really need to understand expansion. The first thing that we need to think about is that expansion of incarceration involves this list of social problems for which incarceration is intended to solve, or people think it's supposed to solve it, that this list just keeps on growing. So social problems such as what? Mental health. What else? Homelessness, on point. Addiction. Right? So right off the top, we got three social problems that we know need social solutions, but in this particular age of mass incarceration, which we can name with specificity now, we know that this list of social problems is actually growing. And we still think somehow that prisons and incarceration is supposed to be the answer, really the only answer to those issues. But we need to know that we are seeing and experiencing an age of mass incarceration, a time when, as the professor Mark Lamont Hill argues, the prison is our go-to mechanism of isolation and containment, the central way that we adjudicate disputes, and the primary site where we deal with social trauma and social dilemmas. So we need to be clear contextually when we're talking about this list of social problems that we're actually talking about people. We're talking about over 2 million people, and we know that number. It's helpful that we're starting to get the language about mass incarceration, and we're starting to get that number. We know at this point that we have the highest rate of incarceration here in the U.S. We know we keep hearing 2.3 million. I also find it really helpful to actually imagine what that 2.3 million breaks down to, so that we get a real sense of what's happening with people. So this list of social problems is growing. For example, between 2000 and 2010, a 10-year period, 110 facilities, prisons, were either constructed or renovated in order to accommodate more people. Meanwhile, 16,000 schools were closed, right? We need to know that in addition to these 2.3 million people, that there are other forms of correctional control that tends to get strengthened in this particular moment of incarceration expansion. The 12% is cut off, but 33% of those 2.3 million people are focused on the chart, and then 55% more folks are on probation, another 12% on parole. So these are kind of the real numbers. So what we need to know about this is that it costs a lot of money to get out of jail. That it also costs a lot of money to stay out of jail, especially if you're poor. We need to know that probation and parole fees exist, that when people come out, they're paying on a monthly basis to stay out. They're paying for drug tests. Maybe they're paying restitution fees. Or maybe, as I was talking to some folks yesterday about, maybe they're paying for the pay-to-stay laws. Do we know about these? That people who are locked up sometimes are actually sent bills when they come home for their room and board. It's a law like that here in Ohio, Illinois too. So just something for us to know. Here's my point, y'all, that 1 in 31 American adults is under some form of correctional control, meaning incarcerated on parole or on probation. 1 in every 31. And so in addition to the sheer number of people, over 2 million men and women locked up, including my 23-year-old brother, in addition to that extraordinary number, an even bigger problem is that we tend to think that that's normal. Right? That's just sort of the way it is. So this incarceration expansion is partly about this list of social problems that gets categorized as different ways to incarcerate. We should also be mindful that expansion involves the reach of incarceration into certain communities, into certain families of color in particular, how that's widening. It's a devastating impact on families of color, and I can speak to that personally. But incarceration expansion also means that the carceral spaces are becoming more numerous and sophisticated, that there is technology that is coming into these places to sort of replace human contact. But finally, and most relevant to what I really want to talk about, which is this relationship between schools and prisons, is the fact that prison and incarceration expansion really means that the pathways to incarceration are becoming less recognizable. Right? That's really a key feature of incarceration, that invisibility. And so different people have different angles, different lenses, different lanes through which they try to better understand this issue. Your own law professor, Michelle Alexander, does a masterful, beautiful job of describing the ways in which drugs and the legal war on drugs is one slick pathway into incarceration. But I'm an educator, and so I want to talk to you briefly about some ways in which education and schools create pathways to prison. Partly because I really think it's important for us as educators to really stay alive to this issue, to this expanding prison nation. And I know sometimes that we do that when, we're catching up on marathons of lockdown and locked out and snapped and all of that. But really, I think we ought to be paying attention to it at other times. Mostly because we, educators, and our profession are parties to barricading people in jails and prisons. It's uncomfortable to hear. It's uncomfortable to talk about. But it's really important to see that on every measure of academic attainment, earning a diploma, a GED, or some form of post-secondary education, those who are incarcerated lag behind us in the free world. They have lower literacy levels, they have fewer marketable skills, and a greater prevalence of disability. With regard to education and schooling, incarcerated people are often those who from us once needed the most and somehow got the least. So I wonder, remember, we're wondering, we're worrying, we're questioning. I wonder if you know that. And if you are keeping your eyes open wide to our current situation, which is largely defined by jails and prisons that are so full of brown and black bodies that most everyone who knows what I'm talking about and has good sense is practically begging educators to stop filling them. So I want to talk about the school to prison pipeline because it really annoys me when folks in my field don't know what I'm talking about. It strikes a special chord in me every time I meet someone in the field of education especially, who has never heard of the phrase. Now, I suspect that wouldn't apply to any of you in this room because I imagine that with people like Dr. Kinlock around and Dr. Tyson around, that justice-oriented conversations are happening on this campus all the time. But if you ask somebody outside of this space about this issue, a classroom teacher, a principal, a director, you just might get that, I should know this, but I don't really know this face. And then you'll just have to hit them with the, okay, we're going to work through this together. I really have gotten it. I should know what you're talking about kind of thing more than a few times. So I really often assume that the problem is one of semantics. Because let's be honest, like people don't just walk around talking about the school to prison pipeline, right? Unless you're kind of in this world, speaking this language, engaging this work on a daily basis. It's not sort of typical language. And to be frank, even activists who talk about this all the time talk about it differently, depending on who they're talking to. They use the language very differently. There are several metaphors, I think, or several ways of talking about this. And I can think of how many, y'all, because I'm a teacher? I can think of 3. So if you've read my stuff, you know where I'm going with this. But if you haven't, you need to know that 3 different metaphors are important for us to pay attention to, not because it's just language. Oh boy, I've had some really wonderful conversations over the last day and a half about the power of language. But because these different things speak to different resources. And so it speaks to the kinds of resources that you need to galvanize and leverage in order for things to be otherwise. So let me tell you what they are. The first one is the schoolhouse to jailhouse track. The second is the cradle to prison pipeline. And the third is the school prison nexus. 3 entirely different things. All 3 of these metaphors are really trying to help us understand the ways in which schools move young people, or young people are moved from schools to the streets, to prisons, to jails. But they're talking about different things. So I won't talk about all 3 of them, partly so you'll be enticed to read my stuff, but also for the sake of time so that we can get into that conversation that I really want to get into. So I'll just talk specifically about the schoolhouse to jailhouse track. As I do that, I want you to remember that these 2 others exist and that they are like close cousins, not twins. And it's really important to be clear about not only our language, but how we are directing our efforts and where to seek support. So let's talk about the schoolhouse to jailhouse track. If you are deeply concerned about the ways in which school-based policies and practices help young people along to jails and prisons, then in addition to my own work, you need to read reports published by the Advancement Project. So I see folks that are taking notes. I'll stop, as I go along so that people have access to this. So reports by the Advancement Project. It's a multiracial civil rights organization founded by a team of lawyers who've taken on a variety of civil rights issues, including redistricting, voter protection, immigrant justice, and the on-the-ground realities of zero tolerance. By now, zero tolerance in our schools and workplaces is as common as dirt. But most 80s babies, as I'm looking around the room, can't remember how things got that way. So here's my quick summation. In the early 1990s, there was a spike in juvenile homicides. And then there was this resulting public panic about teenage super predators. Of course, that was all racially coded language. But then there was this passage of federal and state laws to meet the super predators out. And all of this could have easily gone over your head, so no worries. But then the advancement project started putting out these reports that really help us understand what it means when school adults have zero tolerance for children and youth in their buildings, and I want us to talk about that. To understand what it means when school adults have zero tolerance for young people is to first acknowledge that as absolute as zero tolerance sounds, we aren't equally intolerant of all kids. Now, of course, I won't argue that we should be, but why is it that poor students, students of color, LGBTQ students, and students with disabilities so frequently get the short end of the stick? Now, I remember I taught this ed policy class not that long ago, and the topic of discussion repeatedly was on bad kids, right? This notion of bad kids. It was their favorite topic. Everybody wanted to know how to run a tight ship, how to stay sane with so many class clowns and troublemakers in and around their classrooms. And very gently, I tried to help them really unpack the notions and conceptions that undergird that kind of talk. What does it mean when you talk about young people in those ways, right? And as lively as those conversations were, nobody really wanted to answer that question about how we think and talk about children and how we treat them in social and academic contexts. A hush usually fell over the crowd, like nobody wanted to engage that question. Now, granted, these were young pre-service teachers who had very little, if any, direct experience with young people in urban settings. But I think it's also true that we have difficulty acknowledging our own ignorance, right? And we have real difficulty sometimes acknowledging that there are tensions and contradictions that sometimes we feed the things that we are trying to work against, even by joining the profession. So I think that finagling around and diving into and grappling with those tensions is exactly what we ought to be doing. Because if we don't, we'll continue to build schools like Rosa Parks Elementary. That's a fake name for a real place. Where this woman, Ann Ferguson, whose work you should also read, wrote this book, Bad Boys, found that black male students of 10 and 11 years old were routinely described and openly described by school adults as at risk of failing, unsalvageable, and bound for jail. So I want you to help me out here. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but, one more time. Sticks and stones may break my bones, but, bullshit. Yes, they will. Because when our perceptions are so profoundly distorted that we can think and talk about young people in these ways, then we have no trouble acting accordingly. Period. In a room of 30 students with precious few resources to go around and with the alphabet soup of standardized tests never far away, we have no space, no patience, zero tolerance for misbehavior. The problem, of course, is that what counts as misbehavior depends. Black boys, for example, are often seen through cultural images of black males as both endangered and dangerous. And their transgressions are sometimes framed as different from those of other children. Black boys are what Ann Ferguson calls doubly displaced. Y'all get that? Doubly displaced. Meaning that as black children, they are not seen as childlike, but adultified. Their misdeeds are made to take on a sinister, intentionally fully conscious tone that is stripped of any element of childish naivete. As black males, they are often denied the masculine dispensation that white male students get as being naturally naughty. Instead, black boys are discerned as willfully bad. So what do? We put them out. We put them out of class and we put them out of school. We suspend them. We punish them excessively, usually for minor offenses like talking about a Hello Kitty bubble gun, hugging a friend, chewing a Pop-Tart into the shape of a gun. I did not make this up, y'all. So in Chicago, where I live and work, zero tolerance policies in the district school system were abolished for restorative justice practices some years ago in 2006. But since then, suspensions have nearly doubled. part of the problem, of course, is that there aren't the resources and support to actually implement restorative justice with fidelity. But in any case, again, Black boys, statistics in this issue, suspensions and expulsions, are atrocious. Now, I should also say that Chicago has its issues. As soon as I came here, I picked up the local newspaper and saw a whole spread about Chicago in the Columbus newspaper. So certainly it has its issues. Our schools have our issues. Chicago's the epicenter of neoliberal school reform. It's the third largest school district and one of the few in the country without an elected school board. We've had over 100 neighborhood school closures in the last several years, and an 8-fold increase in money going to charters. 126 of our schools don't have libraries. So I can go on and on about Chicago. But really the point is, wherever you're located, that this issue exists. This problem exists. We not only suspend young people, but we expel them. We not only suspend them and expel them, but we arrest them in schools. We create booking stations in our schools, right, to make arrests easier, faster, and more efficient. When we have zero tolerance for our kids, we lose all concept of kids being kids. Wiggling, jumping, giggling, fidgeting somehow gets labeled and medicated. And when that doesn't work, we beat them. Yes, we beat them. In 20 states, corporal punishment is still allowed. When we have zero tolerance for kids and their misbehavior, we even fine them. And back home, there's this big charter school collective, Noble Charter School, that collects $200,000 annually on discipline fees, right? Actually, I did a talk not too long ago, and there was a noble person in the crowd, a former noble person in the crowd, and she waited until I was finished and came up to me and said, actually, your stat is wrong. We give $300,000. So they rack it up because they give you $5. They make you pay $5 per infraction for the tiniest of infractions, like missing a button on your button-down shirt or being seen with a bag of chips. Add that to the revenue from a summer behavior class at $140 per registrant, and you really do have yourself a really promising fundraiser on the backs of Black and brown people, right? So if the kids for whom we have zero tolerance have not yet dropped out, which is where this is going, right? You create uncomfortable situations, environments, and cultures for young people. They say, peace out, and then what, right? But if kids for whom we have zero tolerance have not yet dropped out, we transfer them to other schools. That's sort of a slick way to move young people. Or we counsel them to schools or programs like the Job Corps. It's been called the U.S. Department of Labor's boarding school for the bottom of society. Not my words. And what I would really argue is kind of a pit stop in this school-to-prison pipeline. I can say more about that, too, if folks are interested later. So I can go on, but again, the point is there are school-based policies and practices, ways of doing things that we're just conditioned to do that we know, that scholars and researchers know, move certain young people out of school. And these are the young people, the boys in particular, who eventually become men. Men who constitute nearly 50% of the adult males in prison. Men who are well primed for neither college, career, nor full participation in our democracy, but instead for punitive institutionalization, for taking their place in that pie. So this is what the schoolhouse to jailhouse track tries to show us. And so for those of you who are moved by that sort of brief description of some of the very popular policies, school-based policies and practices that nudge you to drop out, then I hope you'll consider grounding your educational experience here at OSU and perhaps your work in teaching or your activism in dismantling the schoolhouse to jailhouse track and reframing your work in such a way that the school is not a place of punishment, that the school doesn't label more people LD and BD than it does PhD and JD, that the school is not the primary gateway to menial labor, the streets, and permanent detention. I think your job is to yearn for and create the kinds of schools that folks don't need to recover from. I want you to look at your position, whatever that may be, and your time here at this university, and then perhaps your career, as disrupting the school to prison pipeline. And this is sort of radical, folks, but I want to put it out here. I want you to think about your work as engaging in anti-prison work. So that's what I wonder. Bless you. That's what I wonder, but I also come to this room with a set of worries, and I'll go through those relatively briefly. I worry, quite frankly, about this notion of heroism. I worry about heroes, because there are real issues here that need to be addressed, but one thing we don't need is another hero. So as I'm talking and as you're thinking about your own wonderings, your own worries and your own questions, I just want you to keep that in the back of your mind, that one thing we don't need is heroes. We need comrades in a similar struggle. We need folks in solidarity and community. We need people who are interested in linking up and figuring out what we can do together. So I worry about that. On a lighter note, I worry about people who came tonight for the food. Because I'm kind of interesting. It's not about the food. No, seriously, because this work really requires a lot of energy, a lot of authenticity. It requires a lot of commitment to acknowledge things that many people want to dismiss. And so I don't think you're going to get that kind of energy if you're just coming for the food. Okay. I also worry about exhaustion. I was just in a really lovely, engaging conversation with students and faculty here. And one thing that came up is everything I've talked about so far is real, and many people know it to be true. Some people in this room may have experienced it themselves. But talking about this issue and dealing with it and trying to imagine possibilities and pathways forward is heavy. You can feel it in your being. So the question from the audience or from one of our colleagues in the group was, what do you do? Because I feel tired. That was the language. I feel tired. Feel it on my insides. And I worry about that. I think that's a legitimate concern. Exhaustion, feeling of being tired, feeling overwhelmed by so many pieces. Particularly, and I hope this comes up in our larger conversation, particularly when you try to imagine how to do the best work you can as an educator with this whole contextual surround bearing down on you, right? Real constraints that keep you from doing the work that you want to do. And finally, I worry about a lack of a hopeful framework. Hope, which is really the title of this talk, and I did all of that I've done for the last few minutes really because I wanted to talk about this last point around love and justice and joy. So I want to offer that, if you don't mind, as we think about self-care, as we think about feelings of exhaustion, as we think about feelings of tiredness. I want us to imagine a hopeful frame. So just before I offer this, I just want to remind you, in just a moment, I'm going to ask you, what do you wonder, what do you worry about, and what do you question? So for those of you who've read my work, you know that I try to imagine talks sometimes. I write sometimes thinking at some point I'll have the opportunity to do this. And so in this book that's in the back, the very end of the book, I try to imagine that hopeful frame. Most of the book, I spend the time trying to get in my own mind a sense of the reality within which I work. What does the world look like? What do schools look like for young people today? What will my own children be faced with as little black boys? But I also know that I need to keep this hopeful frame. And I write about it sometimes. And so here's, one imagined talk that I hope to give to somebody, but now I actually have an audience. And I titled the talk Getting Intimate because I really think that's a sexy and provocative way to be lured into serious discussion, particularly serious discussion about heavy topics. And certainly there are other sort of titles or subtitles that might more appropriately define the moment that we're in, of accountability and corporate style reform, when routine detachment from the messiness of teaching and learning really is the only surefire way to keep your job and your sanity. I realize that suggesting that we think about centralizing intimacy in our work is sort of a bold path forward. But I want to just take a few minutes and try to pitch that anyway. I want to pitch it and leave it there as we begin our larger conversation. I want to pitch and make an argument for why love, why justice, and why joy in education, particularly at this moment, given the context that I just laid out, are really dangerous and worthwhile pursuits. So I'm going to keep it to just those, how many points? Gosh, just those 3 points. Love, justice, joy. These 3 concepts, I think, better explain what I mean when I suggest that we, students, teachers, teacher educators, administrators, and anyone else who cares deeply about the social and academic lives of young people ought to consider letting a commitment to intimacy guide our work against the prison pipeline, guide our work in incarceration prevention. So point 1 is love. So to explore this first idea, let me try a little experiment. When I say love, what comes to mind? Families. I heard something over here, but it wasn't quite clear. Families. Pets. That makes me smile. Romance. Okay, compassion. Power. Relationships. Anyone else? I think all of those are appropriate. Those things come to my mind too when I think of love. And when I think about love in education, though, I think about something very specific. I think about love as action. I think love not necessarily as something romantic, not something mystical, not something abstract. I think about love as the action we take to enhance or alter our own or someone else's well-being. It's a very sort of feminist bell hooks sort of approach to action, to love. And I think that part of what we need is to think about what love means in educational spaces. I think love is connected to the world of education in schools, to teaching and learning, and I want to say a bit about that. Feminist scholar Beth Brandt tells us that who we are is written on our bodies, our hearts, and our souls, and that in each of us there's a desire to be known and felt, to be acknowledged and validated, to have our histories confirmed, to be witnessed for what has been and what is to be. I first ran across this quote years ago before my brother was incarcerated, but now when I read it, I have an entirely different relationship to this notion of witnessing people. Witnessing as an act of love, deliberately attending to people, to seeing and taking notice of that which they think is meaningful. Fears and desires are situated in a sense of past and future, and experiences become the fabric of time and space. To witness, which I think we ought to be doing, is to validate the existence of stories and to protect their places in the world. Each of us has a story. Becky Roper's Human writes, we are acting as witnesses when we are participating in knowing and learning about others, engaging within constructions of truth, and communicating what we've experienced to others. So I'm reminded of that 90s flick, White Man Can't Jump. Everybody seen that? when one of the main characters, Sidney, claims that his counterpart, Billy, can't possibly hear the rich messages and music of Jimi Hendrix. You remember that scene? He says, look, man, you can listen to Jimmy, but you can't hear him. There's a difference, man. Just because you're listening to him doesn't mean you're hearing him. I think we can make a similar kind of distinction between watching and witnessing. When we show our love for others, for young people, for students, for families, by witnessing their lives, we are complicit in active and partial meaning making about those experiences. We're sort of up close and personal. We're brazenly in their business. I'm encouraging that. It means that we want to know what pleases them and interests them, what saddens and shuts them down, what they're curious about, and what sets their souls on fire. I think there's a particular urgency of witnessing within the context of marginalization and wrongdoing. Being a spectator of calamities taking place both near and far is really the quintessential part of the American experience. I think of the recurrent theme in slave narratives and the writings of Holocaust survivors who describe the trauma of public indifference to their struggles, that persistent feeling of being made mute, of being invisible, that really made things even more difficult to deal with. So at a minimum, I think that bearing witness to the pain of significant others is the act of validating and advancing their fundamental rights to peace, fairness, and humanity. So we do this by watching closely in the particular context in which people try to make sense of things. We listen intently and provide a captive audience for critical reflections on the tough questions of guilt and responsibility. So we witness and we engage. Anybody know Jawanza Kunjufu's work? Some people. So Jawanza Kunjufu has authored many books on the condition of African American males, the most popular being The Conspiracy to Destroy Black Boys. And he's often considered a separatist. He's considered a man of many points, many opinions, and very few credentials. But quite honestly, I think his points are pretty good. And one of his points that I really love is this one. You cannot teach a child you do not love. You cannot teach a child you do not respect. And you cannot teach a child you do not understand. This is, I think, one of the most critical elements necessary for the creation of safe and productive learning environments. So that's what I think about love. Here's what I think about justice. I think, and I'm going to just very quickly advocate for teacher activism. I think we should think about teacher activism as a mechanism of dismantling the school-to-prison pipeline. This phrase, teacher activism, really conjures images of fist-pumping, community organizing, card-carrying union folks. And being one such person who is card-carrying and community organizing and fist-pumping, I recognize and resonate with that kind of experience, that description. But I also think that teacher activism means lots of other things, and we should be cognizant of what those things mean, because teacher activism suggests something for what it might mean to get intimate. Here's what we need to remember. That schools have always served, historically, the purpose of socializing, asking teachers to foster responsible, independent, law-abiding community members, economic purposes, and also political purposes. So teacher activists take a particular kind of stance on that task, right? For teacher activists, the issue of equity and outcomes for students, for schools, and the wider community are central. This means that inside of classrooms, kind of what we were talking about earlier, inside of classrooms, teacher activists push themselves and students to examine matters of importance to them, to ask why things are the way that they are, and to analyze who benefits most from the status quo, and finally to explore possibilities for how things can be otherwise. And then outside of the classroom, they take other methods in order to address the larger issues that bear down on the work that can actually happen in classrooms. So naturally, this notion of teacher activists makes many people uncomfortable, mostly because you sort of expect a lot of flack when you are trying to think critically about the world around you. It's like okay to be a mentor and a parent, a guide on the side, a sage on the stage, but mention activism or activists, and then immediately people start thinking of polemics, right? Agitators. So I think it's important for people to understand that that's sort of part and parcel of the job of being a teacher activist. It's just what you should expect. But there is no such thing, really, as a politically neutral school. And there is no such thing as a politically neutral teacher. The question is not really whether ideologies are being promoted, but which ones are and how well we like them. So, teacher activism, I think, is part of this notion of justice, the commitment to justice. And I think we ought to consider that as part of our hopeful framework, love and justice, but also joy. I'm thinking of my sister Halima, who brought that notion of being overwhelmed and tired. I'm thinking of you now as I think about joy, the necessity of joyfulness. And since I'm running out of time, I'm going to keep this point direct. All of us tend to get so caught up in the difficulties of the work ahead that we forget that our work is really important, that education really is the most impactful interdisciplinary field there is. We forget that our job is really to give students an education that's responsive to their identity and their cultural backgrounds. And I think that this is part of that intimate labor in which educators can and should engage. I think that getting intimate means caring. It means worrying about what happens to people in our everyday lives. It means attending to their individual needs, their perspectives and interests. It means accepting the answers to the questions that may bring uneasy and jarring levels of consciousness, to the ways in which we receive, recognize, and respond to others and ourselves. It means organizing our work around caring for human affections, weaknesses, and anxieties. It means getting to know people in all of their particularity. And then our challenge is to connect what we know with what we do. Because getting intimate means teaching and learning in the spirit of community and solidarity, or as my mother once said, being willing to walk the path with someone else. So in the final analysis, I think that getting intimate requires every adult who works with young folks in our education system to love and respect children, to wake up each day to struggle and strive towards social justice, and to find joy in it all, or to go do something else. Thanks. So then my question is, what are you thinking? My question is, what are you wondering about? What are you worrying about? And what do you question? And I want to noodle on those and have some conversation with you and ask, maybe answer some of those questions. So can I give you 3 minutes, no more, to talk to yourself, talk to a neighbor, get your thoughts together, and then I want to hear what you think. Yes? Thank you so much, folks. I'll check in 3 minutes. So we should come back together as a collective and try to throw out some issues that maybe we can noodle on together or I can noodle on. Is there anyone who wants to offer a wondering, a worry, or a question?
My name's Tim San Pedro, assistant professor in multicultural and equity studies. We just had a really great abbreviated 3-minute discussion, and we were talking about how we wonder and we worry, particularly in courses that we teach where pre-service teachers come into our classrooms and we are charged the task of helping them understand their position, their perspectives, and how they are products of education that help them get to the classroom seats that they're in now, right? That they are products of a system that has encouraged them and helped them, all while we're advocating for or helping them think about the students who aren't in those seats, right? The students who were pushed out of classrooms and of schools that don't see the quality and the purpose of education. And so I worry that the students that we have come in with so much hope and promise and purpose and love of the education that they received. However, we have the task of one checkbox course to say, you know, you need to understand equity, you need to understand diversity, you need to understand the importance of multicultural education and social justice. And we have them one semester of 4 years, and that the work is only beginning. And how we value and validate their perspectives and positions when they come into our courses, while also challenging and pushing them forward to advocate for more inclusive types of education that get students who don't look like them, to get students who did not benefit from the classrooms that they went through, to see the purpose and quality in education that they themselves felt. So that was the conversation that we had, and so that's sort of our worry, or my worry. I won't put it on the rest of you, but our worry, or my worry, of you know, the work that we're asked to do with the students that come into our classes. Is it enough? And is the work that we're doing changing in any way? Changing others, changing ourselves?
Anyone want to comment back? Respond? What your comment made me think about right away is the teacher shortage, particularly shortage of teachers of color. And the fact that people who want to become teachers generally felt respected when they were students, right? So what does it mean that we have such a shortage of students of color, teachers of color, knowing what we know about the experiences of young people going through schools? So really the point is we are gonna see this shortage of teachers of color in particular for a long time to come, so long as we still have these other issues with how young people are coming through schools. Y'all with me? So that wasn't exactly what you're speaking to your worry, but it's another worry that your worry raised for me. Other folks? Let me just say, I think this is a wonderful opportunity. If you look around, so many different folks in the room, that this really is an opportunity to kind of draw on the wisdom in the room. So I'm excited to facilitate this and answer anything I can, but you should also take advantage of each other. Hi.
My name is Daniel Owsley. I actually lived 14 years in inner city Chicago, in the South Side, in Inglewood, if any of you guys know where that is. And in my 14 years going there, I can state personally that I can count on one hand how many black male teachers I've had. Even black teachers, I could probably count on two hands. And even growing up, I've never gone to a school where until I came to college, where it was predominantly white, predominantly like not minority, basically. So, and I thought that was interesting, that even of the people that I could count, they were African American teachers. They were, two of the three were gym teachers. So it was like, I didn't have anyone to look to. And I was lucky enough to have my parents who very much cared. And they got me out of that situation when I was 14. And I see a lot of my friends who didn't have the same support structure I have, not have a role model, have role models that may not have been the best. And I sit in here and think about it. And that's one of my worries. Like, where are the role models? We may have mentors who come into the school, but I can tell you, like, the vast majority of the people I know from personal experience don't respect them or view them as like some person coming in just telling them what to do. So
it's true. Thank you for the comment. So it's true that black male teachers are virtually missing from the profession. That 2% of all teachers are African American males. And it's exactly what you're saying, that they function largely in these disciplinary roles, as deans, as assistant principals that are largely responsible for discipline issues, as PE teachers, coaches, athletic coaches. So I think what you're observing is actually what bears out in my stats too. And you're right, that we're missing out. And that the recruitment around African American males into the profession doesn't need to be organized around this push or this draw or this kind of connection to the culture of punishment. In other words, that black male teachers shouldn't be recruited to be enforcers of urban school discipline, but instead as pedagogues, as people who can teach content area information. I think that worry is legitimate.
My name is Natasha Willis, second year PhD student in Ed Policy. And I have a lot of wonders and worries, especially kind of studying the same exact thing that you're studying. And just to Professor San Pedro's, my kind of wonder and worry, when I initially came to Ohio State, I was in the Cultural Foundations of Education program, and realizing after being a teacher for 5 years, that kind of need, I felt like even when I became a teacher, even being a person of color, I still didn't completely understand a lot of the students of color that I worked with. And just thinking about the coursework and the preparation, and as I've come back, that program no longer exists. And so that's a worry of mine is, well, kind of, okay, so how are we getting this information to teachers, to pre-service teachers? I'm in ed policy now, and I'm able to still kind of examine those same interests that I had before, but if we only have like you said, one class out of the 4 years that they're here, if we're not providing any social foundations, any different cultural foundation coursework, how are we really preparing our teachers? So that leads to my question of if we keep closing these programs, how are we going to continue to prepare our teachers to work with just different students in general? And so just being a student, from a student perspective, I'm worried, even just knowing that preparation, I didn't totally feel kind of prepared even when I left, just as far as working with all different types of students. So you can even be a brown or black person and still not even kind of be prepared to even work with others if you didn't come from that particular situation. So it's kind of like a mixture of worries that I'm still wondering, how am I even going to help myself, but still going to keep on with the fight. So
I suspect that, as you mentioned, that this is not an isolated concern, that there are lots of people who are struggling with, how do I make the most of my resources? How do I acknowledge the fact that teacher education is not at its best, that leadership preparation is not at its best? That we don't have a lot of resources to go around, but I'm still a teacher and I need to do the best that I can. One thing that we talked about in one of our discussions yesterday was the notion of teaching like your students won't get access to you next time, right? So knowing that there are all kinds of constraints, that in a perfect world that we would have access to the resources that we need to do our jobs well, perfectly, but that we don't work in such a world. So the struggle is it's exactly what you were saying. How do I acknowledge my own deficiencies as an educator? How do I put my commitment to doing even better in place, knowing that I'm underprepared to do so? And so I think that layering that other conversation onto this one, part of what you might consider doing is thinking about how to work within these circumstances as if the students in front of you won't have access to somebody who's as thoughtful, who's as critical, who's as concerned, who is as worried as you are. So how do you invoke that kind of energy in a way that both acknowledges the constraints but figures out creative ways to work within them? Sure, please.
I would like to. Okay. My background is I come from a very small town in central Ohio, and it's a town of about 2,000. And growing up, we had no teachers of color, and I think one student of color in the whole school. So when I came here to Ohio State as a student, it was really my first exposure to diversity of any kind, because the only diversity we had in our town was this person drove an orange tractor and this person drove a green tractor. So that's the kind of diversity we had there, not much. So when I came here, I benefited so much from classes like women's studies, black studies. I came out of here with a women's studies minor, a major in English, a major in psychology, and I got a nursing degree. So I went on to work as a mental health worker in an adolescent program for 10 years. And everything I learned here, while it was pretty small and nobody made me take these courses while I was here, it changed my life. So you're worried that you're not going to do enough. You should be really glad, because you and people like you have changed my life. And my children went to school in the same high school that I grew up in. There might be 3 students of color now instead of 1. But they're all very open to diversity. They've all gone to universities that had great diversity in them. And they're very open people to other people of all types. And I credit educators for that. And what you did allowed me to branch off of that and affect other people in my life. So just because you don't see it doesn't mean it's not happening. So I hope that helps.
Thank you so much. Welcome. Hi.
So to add to that a little bit, as a white person, when I have conversations with my white friends, a lot of them don't have awareness of white privilege and things of that nature. How do I put the mirror up for them? How do I educate them to know that these types of things are happening? That's one of my worries.
I have a thought, but I'll share the mic.
Well, I don't want to interrupt your thought because we want to hear that. I guess my similar question or worry is like, when you're preaching to the choir, when you're talking to people who think the same way you do, you can say lots of things and you're in agreement and you're on the same page. But with the teaching population, like I'm thinking about some of the metaphors and some of the like cultural propaganda that just comes through the generations. The majority of people who are in the teaching field are the same people who were, through the generations told that like this kind of Tarzan, like, what's the big gorilla? There you go, King Kong. You're being rescued from these big black beasts. Like there's a lot of propaganda that people don't even realize that they're taking in. So the same people, teachers who are in the classrooms, are also in society being told that this prison system is protecting you from this ugly beast out here who wants to destroy you. So it's like, how do you get the people who are benefiting kind of from the propaganda to push back against it? Like, that's a challenge.
She said exactly what I would have said, and that's not bad.
So, if there's anybody in the room who has, experience addressing issues of whiteness and white supremacy, feel free to jump in. My thought is that you don't have to. I hear what you're saying, and I want to speak directly to that. But I also just want to put out there that you don't have to be white to experience, take advantage of whiteness, right? That whiteness as a system of privileges doesn't belong only to white people. And having difficult conversations about issues of power and privilege and oppression are conversations that have to be had with everybody, regardless of what color or race or whatever you are, right? And somebody asked me the other day about working at a predominantly black institution where school principals are, my students are mostly black. So what is it like having these kinds of conversations with black people in positions of power? And I suspected it would be, very similar to perhaps the conversations that you're having in this particular way. Lots of people are grounded very deeply in this idea of bootstrap ideology, right? That it's all about personal responsibility. You pull yourself up by your bootstraps, and if you don't, it's on you. And so I also have a similar struggle when I have new students who come in thinking, well, I've been in the community, I've been around, so I see when young people needed to get it together, right? So I think the question that maybe I want to try to address or try to think through, or maybe we can all think through together, is how do you have difficult conversations about critical lenses? Or how do you have difficult conversations that employ a critical lens? Anybody have experience with that? Addressing critical issues in education, in society, particularly with folks who see the world through this personal responsibility, it's individualistic, it's all about meritocracy, it's all about a level playing field, the effort you put in is what you get out.
Hi, my name's Michael. I'm in the Social Studies MED program, and we were just having a conversation over here about this type of thing and talking to students of color. And I teach I'm a pre-service teacher, student teaching at Fort Hays, which is about 80% minority students. And I was having a conversation about wealth and wealth inequality. And my uncle owns a business that was started in the Jim Crow era. So I was trying to explain to my students how wealth is accumulated over time, and that it's not just a bootstrap story, that I'm a product of privilege because I have a wealthy uncle who's given me a lot of benefits. And that company is started in a time when that wasn't allowed for everybody. These things are not equal. So history is unequal. And so I was just trying to expose myself and tell the truth about things, that I'm just accepting that I'm in a place because of privilege, and just explaining that to my students and telling the truth and being open and honest and not trying to hide it, I guess. But if I could add one thing about a worry that I have, is a curriculum driven by standards that are consistently Eurocentric. And I guess in the social studies world especially, how history of particularly Africa, Asia, and South America are marginalized, and we're focusing so much on the founding fathers and these documents and how great American society is, and it seems like every course and all the curriculum and all the standards lead us to this place where we're worshiping how great America is, when we should be looking at other places. Other places have great things about them too. And I'm worried about being constricted in my future practice by Eurocentric standards.
So I think that was actually a very specific response to the question earlier. What do I do? Well, I think what Mike, right? I think what Mike just said is tell the truth, which I find really useful. A couple of things just came to mind too around telling the truth. One is that you have to sort of shore up your toolbox of materials. And so one way to do that is to get alternative materials, to scour alternative materials. So rather than reading, I don't know, who's a popular person who writes history books, whatever. Read Howard Zinn, right? The People's History, read that. Expose maybe your friends to more kind of community-oriented, community-based, activist-oriented, community-based organizations. There's also this article specifically addressing the issue of how to talk to white people about white privilege, which is what I think I heard you say. There's also this really interesting article. It's not a scholarly article, but it is really on point, and I cannot remember the title exactly. But essentially, it's this metaphor, explaining white privilege as if you were explaining how I need somebody to Google this. Explaining white privilege how do I understand white privilege while riding my bike? Exactly. Thank you so much. So the idea here is that maybe your friends don't want to read Howard Zinn. And maybe they don't want to go to a rally or participate in a community organization. But this article really does explain what white privilege is in a sort of gentle, comical way, maybe. Would you agree with that? Concrete resources. Can I invite anybody else to share?
Hi, I'm Ann. I'm a first-year doc student after retiring from 35 years in education, 20 of those years spent in Columbus City Schools, so I have quite a bit of familiarity with the urban district. My question is, this is such a complex issue, from standards I'm thinking of to we have people running for president who want to have people carry guns into schools, to being an actual teacher, how we teach. And I always go back to that first part. We are still doing, the gentleman, Mike, over here mentioned the European-centric teaching as far as white women teaching for a really long time. And the whole idea of everybody's still, it's this necessity of sitting in chairs and sitting, and you have to attend quietly, but we don't address the needs, for example, of how, for example, little black boys learn, which is movement. I've read some stuff earlier, but I've also, all of a sudden, if they're moving, you're bad, and yes, you have to be medicated, or you're disabled, or whatever, rather than, how about if we teach and we move together? When we're 4 and 5, we should be playing, and they should be, how about engage them? So I guess I go back from the very beginning. If you're talking about, when you said about respecting kids and understanding, and you do have to understand how kids learn. We do have to understand that sitting in a chair, for so many minutes, or even sitting in circle in kindergarten is not appropriate for many kids. But when kids come in and really need to learn, can we move? I think we also need to start teaching how we teach with different methods. And so that's some of my thinking is if we want to keep kids in school, and another thing I guess I just want to say quickly is, if those of you from Columbus for a long time are familiar with the Short North Posse, I'm sure I know you are. I served on a jury a few years ago, a special jury for 3 young men, all African American, who it was a whole drug, talk about the school to jail pipeline thing. But just the short story is, I'm listening to the horrors, of course, that these guys did, who a couple of them actually were in prison, which we didn't know about already, okay, or during this trial. But I'm looking at these young men who are obviously leaders, entrepreneurs, organizers, had good accounting skills. And so my thing is, I guess I always have to go back to the crux of the thing, and the title of your whole thing about the school to prison pipeline is, we have got to start to notice those qualities in kids when they're young, that, oh my gosh, that's an entrepreneurial thing, because if not, then they're going to go, it helps with the whole gang life. So I just think that we also need to be looking at that. I just keep thinking, oh my God, what you guys could be doing in your community. You could be, millionaires opening your own businesses, but whatever. But they did open their own businesses, So I don't know. I have a lot to say on it, and I've just been with it for a really long time, and we just need to change the way that I think that's what I'm thinking is where we start. Letting kids learn how they need to learn.
And that does not mean that we put wheels, pedals underneath young people's desks. Y'all seen that? What in the world? Recess. That's what it's called. Recess. The question of sort of working backwards and trying to imagine what did we miss, I think is a good one to pay attention to. And also trying to look in the opposite way. It's exactly what you're saying. What skill set do I see? What asset do I see in this young person? This whole notion of deficiency, of deviance, of pathology is part of the struggle. Our ability to look at young people and see beauty, to see assets, which is part of what I'm talking about when I'm talking about love, I think is on point. I appreciate the comment.
I'm Rhonda Johnson. I work for the city of Columbus, but I was a teacher in the district for 35 years. And I just wanted to offer some advice to a couple people. Mike, you have to be a courageous teacher. I remember one of my teaching friends said, "Oh, I don't use that curriculum guide. I teach my kids what they need to know to be successful." So keep that in mind. Just because it's in the guide, remember, it's a guide. And so the way that you teach, you can bring in other things into your classrooms that are not there in that curriculum guide in the book because you won't see them. But those are the things that your kids are going to need to be successful. So be courageous and do it anyway. Don't worry about the evaluation because your kids are going to do well if you do that. And to the other person about how do you show them the mirror, I would say you be their mirror. And if they're looking at you and they're seeing that, you're the mirror for them. So let your actions speak for that. So you be their mirror.
Thank you.
My name is Olympia Williams. I'm actually an elementary school principal in Columbus. I have about 98% kids in poverty, 95% African American, and I'm wondering a lot of things from your talk, which was very nice. And I guess what I want to say to the people in the room is I wonder what you're going to do when you leave today, because I often go to lots of community talks, and I know that you're here because you're passionate about the topic, you want to learn more. And even the smallest thing that you can do to get involved in the schools and to help these students is going to help them in some way. I know you said they probably look at the role models and they're not important, but they are important. Lots of kids don't ever see anybody who's in college. You know, the people they see are the people in their neighborhood, so those are the people who they look up to. Those are the people who they follow. So my question, and I'm just challenging each of you to get involved and to actually go into the schools, see what's there. If you can't get the experience in your university course, and I went to Ohio State, I've got my master's in Edmond and got my bachelor's here and everything, but you need to get into the school so that you can really see what the challenges are and really know, is this something that you are going to love to do? Because you have to have that love that you talked about. And there is space for everybody in this room and more to help the children out there that need you. So I just want to say, as an advocate for not just my school, but even for teachers, it's helpful to get you in, the diversity, to share your experiences, to help start. This issue is so huge, but if each of us does one little part, we can start to make a difference.
I'm going to circulate a volunteer sheet. Thanks.
Hi, I'm Rebecca. I'm a first-year master's student doing my master's with sensory impairments, specifically in visual impairments, and I myself, I'm visually impaired. And when I was in school, I didn't have anybody to look up to because I was always thought to not have a disability. I was not considered a good student, even though I was, because I would not focus because I couldn't see. I just flat out wasn't interested in anything visual for the obvious reason. So that is what persuaded me to become a teacher. I wanted to change how different kids receive different services in special education. And so I work with a lot of students that have multiple disabilities. So, for example, I have recently worked with one student who is adopted from Haiti. She has very significant needs. She'll never walk or be independent on her own, especially doing basic things such as using the restroom. And it really worries me how people see kids with special needs, especially if they're from different backgrounds. They automatically assume, well, they're not ever going to do anything. When this child that I just mentioned, when she saw me for the first time subbing in her classroom the other day, she was super excited to see me. She started singing a song that I haven't heard in probably a good month and a half. And that was just very astounding to me that she remembered that I always loved to hear her sing her songs.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Brandon. I'm a first-year master's student in the Higher Education Student Affairs program here. I did my undergrad in elementary math education, so I'm somewhat versed. I guess worry is I'm born and raised, educated, proud Flint Community Schools alumni. And so in the state of Michigan, one of my concerns is that we are experiencing, as with a lot of inner city schools, deep financial cuts. My school district has literally gone from, at its peak when I was in school, 15,000 students to now 5,000. We have experienced school closings every single year, so dealing with that whole conflict of students literally having to find a new school identity, pride, and find love in a school that they aren't originally from. As well as in our neighboring city of Detroit, we have a emergency manager who was in that is going in, literally took over half of the schools in the city of Detroit to quote unquote improve them. But when the state takes over and you get these different parties come in, I won't throw any shade towards TFA and things of that nature today, but you get these, and they're supposed to be fixing the issue, but they're making the issue worse. And we still have schools that are having these financial deficits, and we're still having students who are not getting the quality education that they deserve. And so my worry is, at what point do we take the politics out of these things, and what point do we start investing in our future generation? Because we have bright students. They're not adequate, they don't have the necessary resources to do that. But then when they say that the schools are failing, and then the state comes over and say that, oh, we can do better, but then they do worse, then what do you do? Because now the state is taking over what was traditionally ours, and they're creating more harm to our students than what they're saying that they're doing good. So my worry is, how do we get back to the essence of being engaging teachers who genuinely care for our students when we are facing political worries from the people above and the powers that be?
And you combine that with sick outs and tainted water. We are sending good energy to folks in Michigan. I think, if you take that even further, then the question is, for folks who are living it and trying to do the best they can in the here and now, what do we think about that, right? How are folks who are living and trying to work in these circumstances doing the work that they do? So I'm just adding to that worry. Not that I should be compounding your worry, but I'm also worried about that. Do we have anything to offer to him? Tell me your name, by the way. Brandon.
Dr. Tyson, hello, class, good, y'all made it. I think that we talked about in our group a little bit some of the strategy for that, and that is not to let the solutions to the existing challenges, not to let our activism be reduced to a single issue activism. We can spend all of our time worrying about the prison to pipeline, which it's important, But if we don't simultaneously look at who passed the bills to become laws, so that zero tolerance became the underpinning of how the school to pipeline happened. You know, I see a lot. I've been in public schools, city schools, loved it. Teacher education, loved it. But I'm beginning to ask the question about the social political activism, so that we, in my classroom, you know, like in the community I'm doing work, in my classroom I'm doing work, and now I need to be stumping at the doorways of those who are elected officials, so that we simultaneously on multiple fronts have this fight. You know, if there's some issue in society that needs to be solved, take it to the teachers. See, school should have been doing this, and the teachers aren't doing their job, and so then we're going to cut the money to schools, and we're going to come in and we're going to fix it, not paying attention to the fact that the state is messed up. And some of the issues that are now in schools are because of some of the decisions that were made at the local level. So pay attention to who's running for school board and be involved. Pay attention for who's running at the state level and at the national level. You know, like someone mentioned about the presidential races, and that's what's taking up all of our television time. But in November, there'll be some simultaneous races that happen that impact what happens on the local level. And we have abysmal voter turnout when it's time to vote for local issues. The folks who are on the ground making decisions about what happens to our kids and in education. So that's one thing I would say, you know, be involved on a social political level and pay attention to those things. I always encourage my students, you know, I throw out House bill numbers. You know, this week they're going to be discussing something on the floor that has an impact of what's going to happen in your classroom. Be an expert witness. You can do that. What does your local official think about that? And the same thing is true on the education level here at the university. Pay a lot of money to come here. If you're not getting what you think you ought to get, I mean, if I get something at CVS and it's not right, I take it back and demand what I paid for. I encourage these students to do the same thing, to say, you know, I'm in this teacher education program, and I'm going to commit my life to working in an urban center with schools with children who are disenfranchised, who have particular needs, and I don't feel I'm getting what I should. Make some noise about it. That's what I think. What I worry about is that we pay too much attention to what's happening on the front page of the newspaper, what leads in the news, and not enough attention to what happens on page 4 and 5. What happens on, you know, beyond what's leading in the news. And that worries me, because when we need to get social activists together, educational activists together, we've got to be informed. And so that really, really worries me, how we do that.
For those of you who are sort of taking notes, I just want to add that the first piece that Dr. Tyson is talking about, this socio-political scene that's really informing, shaping, impacting what's happening in classrooms. If you're interested in that kind of work, activist scholars claim that that work is cradle to prison pipeline work. Remember I said there were 3 different metaphors? And it's important to think about the language so that you can think about where to direct your efforts. You may be a teacher who feels able, who feels like in, you know, the universe of things that have to get accomplished, that you can position yourself in different spaces. You can do school-based stuff, and then you're going to go outside of the schools and exert your activism in different ways. So you might be interested in both learning about the schoolhouse to jailhouse track, advancement project, those kinds of things that I was just talking about earlier, but then also kind of these macroeconomic policies that shape what is possible or impossible in school buildings. And that's more cradle to prison pipeline work. So that would be looking at laws and policies governing living wages, governing affordable health care, governing whether or not people have access to employment, whether or not people have access to places to live, right? So it's about what are the laws and policies that enable healthy, happy, functional families or not? And then how are those things connected to what's possible for young people who come from such families and communities? So in other words, whereas Schoolhouse to Jailhouse track is focused on school-based policies and practices, the Cradle to Prison pipeline suggests that some young people don't even make it onto the right track, right? They never had a fighting chance to get onto the right track because of the policies and laws that are put into place. So you just sort of have to figure out where's my energy gonna be directed. Maybe, I don't know, do you have time for one more?
My name is Deb, and one of the things that's been coming to mind while everyone's been talking is, for me, it's important that I'm not the person who is the voice of what needs to be changed. I really think the people who are affected most by the bad policies have to be the voice. It has to be their story that gets told. So as I near retirement, one of the things that I want to do is to empower people to be their own voice. And I think that can start in the classroom where, teachers help. Students learn how to be a voice, advocate for themselves. And as time goes on, I think one of the most powerful things I did back in the 90s, I was working with adult students who were receiving aid to family with dependent children. And welfare reform was happening. And they were worried because of some of the changes were going to affect their ability to go to school, have their kids taken care of. So we sat down, we educated ourselves about it, and we took them to the State House here in Ohio, and they got to speak to the legislators. And we invited the legislators to spend the day with the students at school and talk to them about their problems and some of the issues they were worried about. And the legislation was actually rewritten to address some of their concerns before it went into law. It wasn't a perfect law by any stretch, but they felt empowered because they had a voice. So I think some of us as teachers or educators need to help empower people to find their voice, whatever that means, wherever that takes us, and however hard or hurtful it might be. We need to do it because it's not my voice that needs to be heard. It's someone else's that needs to be heard.
Thank you so much. So I think that we see a few more hands, but we're also out of time. So I think to wrap it up, I'm going to thank you so much for participating in our conversation. I'll also say that I'm going to hang around. So if there are questions or concerns that went unanswered that you want to bounce off of me, I'm happy to engage in that discussion with you. But in the here and now, I want to thank you so much for coming and for giving of yourself in this conversation. Thank you.